Jeremiah 29 verse 11 is one of the most quoted and most beloved verses in the Bible. It appears on wall art, graduation cards, journals, devotionals, and encouragement posts because it sounds like a direct promise of hope, direction, and personal blessing. For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans for peace and not for evil, to give you a future and a hope. Many Christians hear those words and immediately think of success, open doors, answered dreams, and a life that will eventually unfold in the way they have been longing for. It is often used as a deeply personal reassurance that God is about to bring something good, visible, and desirable into your life. And because the verse is beautiful, warm, and full of hope, many people stop there. But when we slow down and read Jeremiah 29 in context, we discover that this verse is not smaller than the popular reading. It is much larger, much deeper, and much more costly. The first thing we need to understand is who this promise was originally spoken to. Jeremiah 29 is not addressed to a comfortable people standing on the edge of promotion. It is addressed to exiles in Babylon. God's people have been uprooted from their land, removed from Jerusalem, and carried into a foreign empire. They are not living in visible victory. They are living under discipline. They are disoriented, grieving, and wondering what happened to the promises of God. This is the setting in which Jeremiah speaks. So before Jeremiah 29 verse 11 sounds like a promise of rapid breakthrough, it is a promise spoken in exile. That context changes everything. Exile is one of the great realities of the Bible. It is the experience of being displaced, unsettled, cut off from what once felt familiar and secure. For Israel, exile was not only political loss. It was spiritual humiliation. The temple was central to their identity. Jerusalem was central to their imagination. The land was tied to covenant promise. And now they are in Babylon, surrounded by a world that does not reflect their home, their worship, or their longing. The people who would first hear Jeremiah 29 verse 11 were not standing in a season that looked promising. They were standing in the wreckage of judgment and the ache of waiting. And that matters because Jeremiah 29 verse 11 is often quoted as if it were written to people about to see instant improvement. But that is not how the chapter works. In fact, Jeremiah tells the exiles something they probably did not want to hear. He tells them to build houses and live in them. He tells them to plant gardens and eat their produce. He tells them to marry, have children, and seek the welfare of the city where they have been sent. And then he says something even harder. The exile is going to be long. It will last 70 years. That means most of the people hearing the letter will not personally see the full restoration they are longing for. So the verse about God knowing the plans He has for them is not a promise of immediate escape. It is a promise of divine faithfulness in a long season of judgment, displacement, and delay. This is where the popular reading often misses the depth of the passage. Jeremiah 29 verse 11 is not a quick promise that things will soon go your way. It is not a slogan for fast success. It is not a guarantee that your preferred future is just around the corner. It is a word of hope spoken to a people who must learn to trust God while living for a long time in a place they never wanted to be. The promise is not that Babylon disappears tomorrow. The promise is that Babylon does not cancel the covenant faithfulness of God. That is a much deeper kind of hope. It means God's plans for His people are still real even when their present circumstances look like failure. It means that discipline is not the end of the story. It means exile is not the end of the story. It means judgment itself does not erase divine purpose. That is part of what makes Jeremiah 29 verse 11 so powerful. It is not spoken over easy lives. It is spoken into loss. It is spoken into disappointment. It is spoken into the kind of life that no one would choose. And in that place, God says He still knows what He is doing. That phrase matters. I know the plans I have for you. The people in exile do not know the plan. They do not see the whole path. They do not understand how the collapse of Jerusalem fits into the covenant story. But God knows. The comfort of the verse is not that the people themselves can suddenly read the future. The comfort is that God has not lost hold of it. The future is not random. Their suffering is not outside His sight. Their story has not become meaningless. Even in Babylon, God knows. This is one of the most important shifts the verse asks us to make. Many people read Jeremiah 29 verse 11 as if the main comfort is that I will soon understand why everything happened. But the text does not offer that. It offers something deeper. It says that God knows even when you do not. His knowledge, His intention, and His covenant faithfulness are the foundation of hope. The verse is not mainly about your clarity. It is about His sovereignty. And then there is the phrase often translated as plans to prosper you. This is where another misunderstanding enters. Many modern readers hear the word prosper and immediately think of visible success, financial increase, easy progress, or personal advancement. But the Hebrew idea behind the verse is richer than modern success language. The word often carries the sense of peace, wholeness, well-being, and covenant good. It is not a shallow promise of worldly achievement. It is a promise that God's intention toward His people is not their final ruin. His purpose is not destruction as the last word. Even after discipline, His ultimate direction is restoration. That does not mean the pain of exile was unreal. It does not mean Babylon was secretly pleasant. It does not mean suffering itself was good. It means the end of the story was not abandonment. God had not turned against His people in a final and absolute sense. He had disciplined them, yes. He had given them over to consequences, yes. But even there, He was still the covenant God who would remember, restore, and bring them home in His time. That is why Jeremiah 29 verse 11 should not be separated from Jeremiah 29 verse 10. In verse 10, God says that after 70 years are completed in Babylon, He will visit His people and fulfill His promise to bring them back. Then comes verse 11. That means verse 11 is not floating alone as a general motivational statement. It is tied directly to God's promised faithfulness across a long period of waiting. The future and hope of verse 11 come through the long road of exile, not around it. That is a crucial difference. The promise is real, but it is not rushed. This also means Jeremiah 29 verse 11 is a dangerous verse to use carelessly. If you quote it as if it means God is about to grant every dream in the next few weeks, you may actually wound people who are in long, painful seasons. Someone may be in the middle of grief, sickness, uncertainty, unemployment, relational loss, or spiritual dryness. If they hear Jeremiah 29 verse 11 only as a promise of fast improvement, then continued suffering may make them feel forgotten, misled, or spiritually defective. But if they hear the verse in context, it becomes stronger, not weaker. It tells them that even in long seasons of exile like waiting, God has not abandoned His purpose. That makes the verse much more usable for real life. Because many believers do not live in short, dramatic seasons with quick happy endings. Many believers live through long stretches of uncertainty. They pray and keep waiting. They obey and keep waiting. They grieve and keep waiting. They live faithfully in places they did not choose, carrying burdens they did not expect, trying to remain rooted in God while the future still feels hidden. Jeremiah 29 speaks directly into that kind of life. It says that the presence of waiting does not cancel the presence of God. There is another important part of the chapter that often gets missed. God tells the exiles not only to endure Babylon, but to seek the welfare of the city. That is remarkable. He does not tell them to spend all their energy dreaming of escape while neglecting the life in front of them. He tells them to build, plant, marry, raise families, and pray for the city where they have been sent. In other words, hope in God's future does not produce passivity in the present. It produces faithful living in the middle of imperfect circumstances. That is a needed correction for many Christians. Sometimes when people think about God's plan, they imagine it only in terms of a future breakthrough. They overlook the possibility that faithfulness today, in an unwanted place, is already part of that plan. But Jeremiah 29 shows that waiting for restoration does not mean withdrawing from responsibility. The exiles are told to live, work, pray, and seek good even in Babylon. That means the promise of future hope is not permission to despise the present. It is the strength to live faithfully inside it. And that is one reason Jeremiah 29 verse 11 is so much deeper than motivational Christianity. It is not saying, God has a wonderful plan that will soon make everything obviously better. It is saying, even in exile, even under discipline, even in long waiting, even in a place you would never have chosen, God's faithfulness still governs the future of his people. That kind of hope is not shallow optimism. It is covenant hope. This is one of the most important shifts the verse asks us to make. Many people read Jeremiah 29 verse 11 as if the main comfort is that I will soon understand why everything happened. But the text does not offer that. It offers something deeper. It says that God knows even when you do not. His knowledge, his intention, and his covenant faithfulness are the foundation of hope. The verse is not mainly about your clarity. It is about his sovereignty. This also helps us understand why false prophets were such a danger in Jeremiah's day. There were voices telling the people that the crisis would end quickly. They were offering a more attractive message. They were promising speed, relief, and easy reassurance. But Jeremiah had to tell the truth. The exile would not end tomorrow. The waiting would be long. The people needed not excitement, but truth. And the truth was that God's plan would unfold across a harder and longer path than many wanted. That matters because it shows us that false hope often sounds more immediately comforting than real hope. Real hope is sometimes slower, steadier, and more demanding. That is still true now. People naturally want the version of God's plan that flatters their preferred timeline. They want the prophecy that says the hard season will end next month. They want the promise that turns exile into a short inconvenience. But Jeremiah teaches us to trust God's real word, not just the word we would rather hear. And his real word is better, though harder. It does not promise instant ease. It promises faithful purpose. It is also worth noticing that Jeremiah 29 verse 11 is spoken to a people, not just to isolated individuals. That does not mean it has no personal relevance, but it does mean the original shape of the promise is corporate. God is speaking to his covenant people as a people. Modern readers often individualize the verse so quickly that they lose its communal depth. But the Bible often speaks to God's people together. The future and hope in Jeremiah 29 are about what God will do for his people in the larger covenant story. That makes the verse feel less like a private success slogan and more like a word of redemptive assurance over the people of God. And still, that communal promise has deep personal comfort. Because believers today also know what it is like to feel spiritually displaced. We know what it is like to live in a world that does not feel like home. We know what it is like to long for God's kingdom while walking through present brokenness. In that sense, the exile theme still speaks with surprising force. We too live as people waiting for full restoration. We too are called to faithfulness in a place that is not yet what it should be. We too need the assurance that God's purposes are not interrupted by long seasons of difficulty. That is why Jeremiah 29 verse 11 fits into the larger biblical pattern of hope through waiting. Abraham waited. Israel waited. David waited. The prophets waited. The faithful remnant waited. Even the New Testament church lives in waiting, looking toward the return of Christ and the renewal of all things. Waiting is not a strange interruption in the life of faith. Waiting is one of its normal environments. And Jeremiah 29 verse 11 speaks into that reality with unusual tenderness. It reminds us that waiting is not wasted when God is the one holding the future. This also means that the verse should not be used to promise what God has not specifically promised. It is not a guarantee that every career plan will succeed, that every relationship will be restored, that every ministry path will unfold smoothly, or that every dream will come true in the form you imagined. To use the verse that way is to place too much weight on it and to ask it to support our preferred script. But the verse is still beautiful, because it promises something even more stable. The purposes of God for his people are full of covenant faithfulness, and even exile does not overturn them. That kind of promise is actually more durable than the popular reading. A quick success reading feels good until life gets hard. But a covenant faithfulness reading survives real suffering. It survives long nights. It survives unanswered questions. It survives the silence between promise and fulfillment. It survives the Babylon seasons of life. Because its foundation is not the speed of visible improvement. Its foundation is the character of God. And that is where Jeremiah 29 verse 11 becomes personally powerful in the deepest way. It tells the believer that the future is not in the hands of chaos. It is not in the hands of Babylon. It is not in the hands of political power, human failure, or even the consequences of sin as the final word. It is in the hands of God. He knows the plans He has for His people. He knows them when they are confused. He knows them when they are grieving. He knows them when they are disciplined. He knows them when they are far from home. And because He knows, hope is possible even before visible restoration arrives. So what does Jeremiah 29 verse 11 really mean? It means that God's covenant faithfulness toward His people remains intact even in exile. It means His plans are not finally for their destruction, but for their future good according to His purpose. It means long waiting does not cancel divine hope. It means the people of God can live faithfully in hard places because the Lord has not forgotten the end of their story. It does not mean immediate success. It does not mean instant escape. It does not mean every personal dream will unfold on demand. It means the God who disciplines His people is still the God who will restore them, and His purpose will stand through even the longest seasons of exile. That is why Jeremiah 29 verse 11 is not a weak verse once you read it in context. It is a stronger verse. It is not a slogan for quick success. It is a promise for people in exile. It is not shallow optimism. It is covenant hope. It is not about getting what you want next week. It is about trusting the God who remains faithful across long years of waiting. And that is what gives the verse its true depth, beauty, and strength. This is where the popular reading often misses the depth of the passage. Jeremiah 29 verse 11 is not a quick promise that things will soon go your way. It is not a slogan for fast success. It is not a guarantee that your preferred future is just around the corner. It is a word of hope spoken to a people who must learn to trust God while living for a long time in a place they never wanted to be. The promise is not that Babylon disappears tomorrow. The promise is that Babylon does not cancel the covenant faithfulness of God. That is why Jeremiah 29 verse 11 is not a weak verse once you read it in context. It is a stronger verse. It is not a slogan for quick success. It is a promise for people in exile. It is not shallow optimism. It is covenant hope. It is not about getting what you want next week. It is about trusting the God who remains faithful across long years of waiting. And that is what gives the verse its true depth, beauty, and strength. And that is one reason Jeremiah 29 verse 11 is so much deeper than motivational Christianity. It is not saying, God has a wonderful plan that will soon make everything obviously better. It is saying, even in exile, even under discipline, even in long waiting, even in a place you would never have chosen, God's faithfulness still governs the future of His people. That kind of hope is not shallow optimism. It is covenant hope. This is one of the most important shifts the verse asks us to make. Many people read Jeremiah 29 verse 11 as if the main comfort is that I will soon understand why everything happened. But the text does not offer that. It offers something deeper. It says that God knows even when you do not. His knowledge, His intention, and His covenant faithfulness are the foundation of hope. The verse is not mainly about your clarity. It is about His sovereignty. That is why Jeremiah 29 verse 11 is not a weak verse once you read it in context. It is a stronger verse. It is not a slogan for quick success. It is a promise for people in exile. It is not shallow optimism. It is covenant hope. It is not about getting what you want next week. It is about trusting the God who remains faithful across long years of waiting. And that is what gives the verse its true depth, beauty, and strength.